You know, even after days grow short and the air crisp, I still go out alone onto the patio at the end of the day. It doesn't take but a few minutes to kind of fold up the raveled sleeve, put it away quietly. But those moments are necessary. Everybody needs a time and a space for things like that. But this particular evening was different. I was there remembering, trying to understand the painful distance between the day as I planned it and the day as it had been. The growing darkness was seeping into mind and heart, and I was as the night. Looking back on it, I know now that it was this evening on which the idea came to me. But frankly, I was in no mood to entertain it. It was not really a new idea, but neither was it old. It was just an idea. And the next evening it returned, and I was relaxed enough to play with it a while before it went away. And then the following evening I spent more time playing with the idea and feeding it, and needless to say, I grew attached to the idea before long. But then I had this fear that it had belonged to someone else, maybe one of the neighbors, and so I would not be able to keep it. So I went to each one of the neighbors. Is this your idea? Well, no, it isn't our idea. Is this your? No, it isn't our idea. So I claimed it for myself and exercised an owner's prerogative by naming it. I called it Doxology. I took Doxology inside to the supper table. Now, this is the only time that Bob and I get to spend time together throughout the day. Conversation is usually reflective, but if we are unusually quiet, I often ask, so what was the worst thing that happened today? And Bob answers, the alarm went off and I had to go to work. Well, what was the best thing that happened? And he grins. The alarm went off and I had to go to work. Tongues are loosed and we share our day with each other. Bob and I agree that Doxology belongs at our table. Well, the next day, Doxology went with me on some errands downtown. We had a grand time, but somehow these little errands did not seem so routine. We laughed at a child who was losing a race with an ice cream cone. His busy tongue not able to keep up with the drip that was running down to his elbow. We studied the face of a homeless man as he stared into a jewelry store window, and I wondered if he was remembering better times. We spoke to the banker, standing there with his thumbs in his pockets behind that plate glass window, looking as if one in possession of the keys of the kingdom. We were delighted by women shoppers who were clutching their bundles and their skirts around blustery corners. It was good to have Doxology along. But I had to stop at St. Joe's to see Joyce. Joyce is dying of cancer. And the gravity of my visit prompted me to leave Doxology in the car. Doxology insisted on going in and was not at all convinced by my reasons for considering it inappropriate to take Doxology into the room of a dying friend. And so I locked Doxology in the car. Joyce was awake and glad to see me. I stepped around the subject of death. And she said, "It's all right. I know, and I have worked it through. God has blessed me with a wonderful family, good friends, and much happiness. I'm grateful. Oh, I do not want to die, but I am not bitter." And then before I left, she had the prayer for me. Back at the car, Doxology asked, "Should I have been there?" Yes, I'm sorry. I didn't understand. Of course, Doxology went with me on vacation to the beach. Ooh, what a good time. A swim before breakfast, a snooze in the afternoon, an evening walk to collect shells. Oh, Doxology enjoyed watching some children make drip castles and then bury their dad up to his chin in the sand, and then their mother turning over in the sun like she was a barbecued chicken. It was fun to walk out in the waves. They would come at us, looking angry and threatening and large, but as they drew near, they began to giggle and fall down. And by the time they reached us, they had kind of rolled over. And together we scratched their soft underbellies, and they ran laughing back out into the sea. Oh, yes, there is no question Doxology belongs on a vacation. Too soon, however, it was time to return to St. Luke's and to my work with students from the School of Theology, explaining all the while to Doxology that really Doxology is unnecessary, superfluous at seminary. After all, do we not spend the day every day writing about God, reading about God, thinking about God? We do not need doxology when we are heavily engaged in theology. Recently, my Covenant Disciple class was discussing Paul's letter to the church at Rome, and the class discovered that in the midst of this weightiest and most influential of all of Paul's letter, the argument is often interrupted by doxology. Early in the letter, in the midst of this discussion about the spiritual state of those who do not know the Bible or have any knowledge of Jesus, Paul inserts this burst of praise to the Creator who is blessed forever. Amen. And then after this very lengthy treatment of his own tradition of Judaism and whether or not God's grace can be trusted, Paul breaks off the argument suddenly and begins to sing. And I love the way Jackson read it. Have you ever come on anything quite this extravagant? This deep, deep wisdom. It's over our heads. We simply can't figure it out. Everything comes from him. Everything happens through him. Everything ends up in him. Always glory, always praise. Yes, yes, yes. Ryan read the same verse, only it sounded like this. For from him and through him and in him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. Time and time again, Paul breaks into his own thought with a doxology, as if he's trying to remind himself of something. Why? Probably because Paul is aware that doxology is most appropriate to the task of theology. Theology begins with words not about God, but to God. People discern first what is sacred, and then have conversation about what is true and right and good. Worship does not interrupt theological conversation. Theology grows out of worship. We just don't add Sunday services just in order to provide something extra in case you have nothing to do. I mean, we provide it because of what is already ours. A mother doesn't put a ribbon in her daughter's hair to make her pretty. It's because she already is. But most specifically, I think, doxology is appropriate to Paul's own life for who he is. I mean, who is Paul to think he can write about the grand themes of creation and covenant and new life in Jesus Christ? Because he is himself a child of that very grace of which he speaks. So why not break into song every now and then, you know? Nothing, in my opinion, could be more appropriate for any of us, whenever or wherever or however. Whether we spend our time at cafe tables talking about justice or sit in calm reflection on suburban patios, doxology is not out of place. I've told you about my first trip to the Holy Land before. It was a whirlwind briefing for clergy who were going to lead groups. Our first night, we were at the Plaza Hotel in Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee, and we met at the hotel restaurant for dinner together. And in the course of the meal, a young woman, an English woman, went up on the stage, stood by the piano, and sang. So she sang while we ate, songs from the 70s and the 80s and from contemporary musicals, all very nice. And then without a break or without any introduction whatsoever, she sang Psalm 121. I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. I mean, it was strange. Even in that place it was strange, and people were awkwardly quiet. I saw her the next morning, and I thanked her for the concert, but I said, would you tell me why the psalm? It really didn't seem to fit. It really wasn't appropriate to your program. And her answer was that she'd made a promise to God to include doxology in every performance she ever gave. She said, if you knew about my life in London, you'd know that that was the most appropriate song that I sang all night. And then she told me briefly about that life. Horrible. And I said, wouldn't it be best just to forget it? She said, no. No. You know, once in a while I have a seminary student who gives it up. Not suddenly, but slowly. You know, their zeal cools, faith weakens, an appetite for the Christian enterprise disappears, the springs dry up, the soul is parched, and you can see it in the eyes grown dull and flat. What happened? Did some kind of evil storm his citadel and take over? No. Did too much study give him too much doubt? No. Were there other more attractive alternatives to ministry that turned his head? No. Nothing quite so dramatic. He simply made the fatal error of assuming that spending so much time talking about God was an adequate substitute for talking with God. He simply lost his doxology. Is there ever a time or place when it's inappropriate to say, for from him and through him and in him are all things, for him be the glory forever, amen? Last Sunday evening, I received the news that Jim Cowell had died. Reverend Jim was a friend and colleague in multiple chapters of my ministry. We worked together in Nashville, and then we moved west about the same time and pastored neighboring churches. And knowing that I was not going to be able to go to the memorial service this last Thursday in Fort Collins, I stopped by his home on Wednesday because I was there for a meeting. I was hoping to find his wife at home. And no one answered the door when I rang the doorbell. So as I turned to leave, another colleague from Nashville days was on the sidewalk coming toward me. And Marilyn and I opened our arms and we hugged one another and just let the tears flow. And we stood there crying in one another's arms for the longest time. And she was actually the first one to break the silence. She said, Janet, I hope you brought doxology. Doxology. No, I hadn't. I had not even thought of doxology since receiving the news. But the truth is clear to me now that if we ever lose doxology, we risk losing everything. So I don't know about you, but I'm leaving a place for doxology at every table that is set for me this week. For from him and through him and in him are all things. To him be the blessing and glory forever. Amen.